Welcome back to The Explainer. I am so thrilled to have you here today. Okay, let's just jump right into this because we are tackling a massive topic. Today, we're demystifying one of the most powerful, complex, and honestly, sometimes controversial forces driving United States foreign policy. We are talking about the theory behind American exceptionalism, because whether you view the U.S. as this global guardian or as an expanding empire, understanding this underlying framework is absolutely essential if you want to make any sense of modern geopolitics.
So let's start with a really big question. Have you ever stopped to think about what it actually means to shape the world? I mean, just think about the immense scale and the sheer weight of a single nation influencing global conflicts, driving international economies, and exporting its culture for well over a century. It's wild. The United States has left a mark on literally every single continent. And that brings us to the massive global legacy of the United States. Following the absolute devastation of World War II, the U.S. really stepped forward. Through the Marshall Plan, it rebuilt ruined nations. Through institutions like the United Nations, it shaped diplomacy. But it's not just military and political. It is heavily cultural. From Silicon Valley's tech innovations to Hollywood blockbusters and brands like Nike and McDonald's, American influence is just woven into the daily lives of billions of people.
So, here's where we're headed today. We're going to define the theory itself, explore both the traditional and the progressive views, examine the concepts of capitalism and imperialism, see how all of this plays out in the UN, and finish up with America's evolving global legacy.
All right, part one, defining the theory.
At its core, American exceptionalism is the belief that the United States is qualitatively different from the rest of the world. Now notice that phrasing. It's not just about being different. It involves possessing a totally unique history, a specific set of values, and perhaps most importantly, a mandate or a built-in responsibility to actually lead the world. It's this foundational framework that both scholars and politicians use to explain America's unique approach to global affairs.
The evolution of this concept is super fascinating. It actually starts way back in 1630 with the Puritan John Winthrop's vision of a city on a hill, this deeply religious ideal of being a beacon to the rest of the world. Fast forward to 1840, the French intellectual Alexis de Tocqueville observed the American democratic system and called it exceptional. But okay, here is a really surprising fact for you. The exact phrase, American exceptionalism, it was actually first used in 1929 by Joseph Stalin. Yeah, he used it as an insult against American communists who felt they were somehow exempt from strict Marxist doctrine. It really wasn't until the 1980s that President Ronald Reagan deliberately revived the term to assert national greatness and kind of reinvigorate the country post-Vietnam.
Moving right along to part two, the traditional view.
So traditionalists rely on a few core tenets to explain this. They argue there is an inherent superiority rooted right in America's founding documents, and this is often accompanied by a really strong sense of divine sanction. Because of these unique values, this school of thought believes America has a profound moral mission to spread freedom and democracy. In this traditional view, American power isn't about conquest or empire building. It's seen as an absolute necessity to maintain a stable international system.
Legal scholar and former State Department official Harold Koch captures this mindset perfectly. He stated, "The U.S. remains the only superpower capable, sustain, and drive an international system committed to international law, democracy, and the promotion of human rights." This really highlights the genuine foundational belief that without American strength and leadership, global progress and human rights would basically just collapse.
Which brings us to part three, the progressive critique.
Let's compare these two totally distinct realities. While the traditional school sees this benevolent guardian out there spreading peace, the progressive school looks at the exact same history and sees a hegemonic, arrogant power. Progressives argue that exceptionalism is often used as a really convenient cover for practicing double standards and hypocrisy. They argue it uses the guise of spreading democracy to justify aggressive, unilateral interventions.
The historian Howard Zinn offers a pretty stark warning from this progressive camp. He wrote, "When you couple that power with the notion of divine sanction, the world is in danger." The progressive critique points out that when a nation possesses the world's most massive military, and you couple that with a righteous belief that God is on its side, well, it becomes entirely incapable of recognizing the limits of its own power. And that, they argue, makes it a real danger to global stability.
And that naturally leads us into part four, capitalism and imperialism.
If we look at this through an ecological Marxist lens, the scholar John Bellamy Foster maps the world into a core and a periphery. Now, in this model, the U.S. is the core. It's a hegemonic power whose primary goal in foreign policy is not spreading democracy, but securing raw materials, capturing markets and utilizing cheap labor to expand capitalist wealth. The periphery, which are third-world nations, are viewed as exploited economies that are structured specifically to meet the external needs of the United States.
So how do critics say this actually plays out in reality? Well, they point to a few key mechanisms. First, after the Cold War, with the Soviet check totally removed, the U.S. expanded pretty aggressively. According to this theory, American capitalism is highly dependent on lucrative military-industrial contracts, meaning it literally needs conflict to sustain itself. Furthermore, critics argue that a lot of those Middle Eastern interventions, they were really about securing oil reserves. They also point out that the U.S. has historically armed former allies, like Saddam Hussein, or the factions that eventually became the Taliban, whenever it suited their immediate geopolitical and capitalist interests. And critics say this entirely contradicts the whole moral mission narrative.
Okay, part 5. Let's look at exceptionalism in the UN.
The relationship between the United States and the United Nations is, well, it's incredibly close, but historically very tense. You know, it's this ultimate love-hate dynamic. The UN relies so heavily on U.S. support, but the U.S. constantly wrestles with whether it should submit to the UN's collective will or just act independently based on its exceptionalist beliefs.
This tension brings us to a really crucial subconcept, exceptionalism. This is when a nation views international laws as non-binding on itself. Because of American exceptionalism, that deeply held belief in unique global security obligations and superior values, the U.S. frequently argues that it simply must be exempt from certain international rules so that it isn't hindered in its mission to protect the free world. It's the idea that the rules apply to everyone except us, for a good reason.
And here is how that exemptionalism actually manifests in the real world. The U.S. has a long history of not ratifying major international treaties that the rest of the Western world readily adopts. A prime example is bypassing the UN Security Council during the invasion of Iraq. Another huge one is the strict refusal to ratify the Rome Statute. This means the U.S. explicitly does not subject its citizens or its soldiers to the International Criminal Court. For progressive critics, this is the absolute ultimate proof of double standards, setting rules for the globe, but explicitly opting out yourself to protect your own domestic sovereignty.
Finally, Part 6, an evolving global legacy.
America's arc of influence over the last century is just staggering. We go from the post-World War II era, where America steps up to rebuild the global order, into this huge era of cultural hegemony, where American tech and media just dominate everywhere. But the third stage is where we find ourselves right now, multipolar shifts. Rising powers like China, combined with borderless global issues, then climate change or cyber warfare, are seriously challenging American dominance. These new challenges absolutely demand multilateral cooperation, which puts intense, unprecedented pressure on that old unilateral exceptionalist way of doing things.
But despite all the progressive criticisms we've talked about, the numbers are still striking. Today, the United States currently pays 28.3% of the entire United Nations peacekeeping budget. The next closest is Japan at just 10.8%. This powerfully illustrates that the U.S. remains the massive central financial engine keeping global peacekeeping operations afloat. Its material and ideological support is still deeply foundational to the international system.
So, synthesizing everything we've looked at in this explainer, America's global footprint is a complex, tangled legacy of unparalleled innovation, sitting right side by side with highly controversial intervention. Whether you lean toward the traditional view of the U.S. as this benevolent guardian of democracy, or you lean toward the progressive view of a self-interested capitalist empire protecting its hegemony, the reality is that this legacy is undeniable. It is deeply intertwined with the fate of the entire globe, and it is a story that is still actively being written.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to ponder. In this new, highly complex, multipolar world we are entering, is America's global influence actually growing, or is it starting to fade? Has the era of American exceptionalism peaked, or is it just adapting to a brand new century? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this deep dive into the source material has sparked some curiosity for you. Go out, explore this topic further on your own, and I will see you next time.